There is a particular kind of patience reserved for those who spent their lives building something they would never see finished. Nowhere is this more evident than in the world of medieval Gothic cathedrals, where progress moved with all the speed and predictability of a muddy ox cart. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. The setting is Western Europe, roughly from the 12th to the 16th century, when kingdoms were young and populations were mostly occupied with the business of staying dry and occasionally avoiding famine. In these towns, the most ambitious structures ever conceived began to rise. Men in wool tunics and heavy boots moved stone by hand, guided by the grand vision of bishops and kings whose architectural enthusiasm was not always matched by financial restraint. It is difficult to overstate the sheer absurdity of building projects that span generations. Imagine giving your entire working life to a single building, only for your children to do the same, and quite possibly their children as well. Construction of Beauvais Cathedral, for example, began in 1225 and was still not finished 200 years later. The spire collapsed midway through, a gentle reminder that even divine inspiration is subject to the laws of physics and medieval engineering. Workers returned to their task with little more than rope, hope, and timber scaffolding, a combination that inspired both awe and lawsuits. If you picture a medieval construction site, it comes with the gentle clatter of chisels, shouted instructions in local dialects, and a steady rain of dust from above. Lunch would be a hunk of rye bread, and perhaps a slab of cheese, if one's fortunes allowed. Protective equipment consisted chiefly of being careful, a strategy that rarely withstood the test of falling masonry. Those who supervised from the ground generally preferred not to climb ladders, leaving the real risks to the ambitious and the unfortunate. The most surprising feature is perhaps the constant shortage of money. Funds arrived sporadically, sometimes through church taxes, sometimes from wealthy patrons eager for a heavenly reward, and often from the pockets of townspeople who had other priorities, such as roofs or soup. The clergy organized elaborate processions to collect donations, all while praying that both the walls and the finances would hold until the next season. When shortages struck, work simply stopped. The town would wait, the half-built cathedral looming over everything as a reminder of both religious fervor and municipal indecision. One can almost see the stone masons, hunched on wooden scaffolding, carving grotesque faces into blocks of limestone. Some faces were intended to ward off evil spirits, though more than a few seem suspiciously like local officials. It is a small personal touch, a trace of medieval humor peering out from a sea of carved saints and angels. So tonight, we look back at what it truly meant to build a Gothic cathedral. It was an exercise in hope, faith, and unyielding repetition, an architectural project as unforgiving as the weather it endured. Now, let us step onto the muddy ground, listen to the echo of hammers, and follow the slow, difficult progress as stone slowly rises toward the sky. Western Europe, in the 12th century, was a society in which most people expected little from life beyond a modest meal, a dry corner to sleep, and the hope that next year's harvest might finally be adequate. It was a world of slow-moving rivers, densely packed towns, and fields that seemed to shrink each year beneath the unending demands of agriculture. Most lived within sight of the church tower, a stone reminder not only of faith, but of the town's relative prosperity. The land itself was divided into feudal estates, with peasants laboring under the watchful gaze of noble families and the occasional wandering bishop. The pace of change was glacial, at least from the perspective of those expected to build anything taller than a haystack. Religion was not a private matter or a periodic concern. It shaped nearly every aspect of ordinary life. Bells marked the passing hours, prayers signaled the start and end of labor, and the calendar was defined by saints' days, feast days, and the seasons of the church. The local cathedral, if one existed, stood not only as a house of worship, but as the social and economic center of the community. Those cathedrals, that aspired to the new Gothic style were both an architectural gamble and a public declaration that the town was worth noticing. There was a certain pride in pointing out visible evidence of piety, even if it came at the cost of generations spent shifting stone from one pile to another. The building of a Gothic cathedral began with a decision often made far removed from those who would bear the strain of actual construction. A bishop might be inspired by a pilgrimage to Chartres or Reims, returning with ambitions that exceeded local resources or common sense. Town councils seldom dared to question ecclesiastical authority, particularly when the promise of relics, new markets, or civic prestige was dangled before them. Fundraising began with an enthusiasm that faded quickly, replaced by the more familiar rhythms of taxation, tithing, and the regular arrival of church officials, who always seemed to require additional contributions. The local nobility, eager for influence and a place in the front row at services, often pledged sums which may or may not have ever been paid. In the heart of the community, the earliest evidence of construction was usually marked by the arrival of masons, carpenters, and skilled craftsmen from nearby towns, or, on occasion, from distant regions. These workers brought with them the distinctive tools of their trades: wooden mallets, iron chisels, roughly hewn ladders, and levels weighted with lead. Their clothing was functional and durable: woolen tunics, leather boots, and simple caps, chosen more for survival than for style. The sounds of their labor blended with the more familiar rhythms of market calls and animal herds being driven through muddy streets. Dust hung in the air, thickening as the first foundations were broken, and the old stone church, if present, was dismantled to make way for something grander and infinitely more complicated. Trade flowed through these communities as consistently as local rivers permitted, though always subject to delay by weather, banditry, or the sudden requirements of those in charge. Stone blocks, quarried miles away, were dragged by ox cart or floated on barges. Timber, often sourced from dwindling forests, was hoarded for scaffolding and roof beams. Iron, required for nails, hinges, and rudimentary lifting equipment, arrived in irregular shipments and was guarded as if it were gold. The procurement of building materials became a long-term affair, creating new opportunities for merchants, while providing the townsfolk with a regular supply of complaints about shortages and the rising price of firewood. Agricultural labor continued in the shadow of the rising cathedral, as fields needed planting and livestock attended regardless of the ambitions of church or town. Many workers were only part-time builders, pressed into service when the agricultural calendar allowed. This ensured that progress was as erratic as the weather itself, with activity surging during slack seasons and grinding to a halt at harvest or during winter's freezing rains. The best that could be hoped for was that the project might outlast the worst of the storms, the periodic epidemics, and the perennial uncertainty of medieval life. Within this context, the cathedral's slow ascent became both a spectacle and a source of local tension. For every sermon about faith and everlasting glory, there were muttered complaints about new taxes, conscripted labor, or the noise that never ceased. The clergy, draped in linen and wool, maintained an air of serene optimism, while the merchants and townsfolk calculated what the next festival might cost them. Ambitious rulers, such as Philip Augustus in France, or Edward the Confessor's successors in England, occasionally appeared in chronicles, their patronage celebrated at length by contemporary scribes. In reality, their involvement often amounted to little more than a grant of land, or a well-timed letter, reminding the town where true authority lay. The materials themselves told another story. The limestone blocks, with their muted tones and occasional fossil, were stacked slowly upward. Timber beams, rough to the touch, filled the air with a faint tang of resin. Iron tools clanged and sparked, a constant promise of both progress and accident. In the midst of it all, ordinary people moved through crowded streets, their attention divided between the excitement of the new construction and the more pressing realities of daily survival. Such was the world in which the Gothic cathedral took shape, an environment defined by cold practicality, uneven funding, and the persistent sound of stones being shaped for a future no living person expected to see. Progress was steady in the way a leaking roof is steady, always visible, rarely complete, and accepted with a combination of pride, resignation, and the faint hope that this time, things might just hold together. Beneath the rising cathedral, Life in the medieval town churned with routines that owed little to the ambitions of bishops or the latest royal proclamation. The presence of a construction site did not interrupt the daily need to fetch water, gather fuel, or tend to animals. Most townspeople worked from sunrise until the light failed, aware that the progress of the cathedral would neither speed up the grain harvest nor prevent the occasional outbreak of illness. Still, the structure loomed above, stone by stone, a visible reminder that the town was, for better or worse, participating in an undertaking that reached beyond the ordinary. Local governance, during this period, was an uneven affair. The town council, such as it existed, managed disputes over grazing rights, market days, and occasionally weighed in on where to store surplus lime or who had failed to contribute properly to the building fund. Royal authorities intervened only when their interests were directly involved, which tended to be infrequent, unless the cathedral threatened to overshadow a nearby castle or disrupt the collection of taxes. Rulers, such as Louis IX in France or Henry III in England, occasionally bestowed privileges upon towns supporting grand ecclesiastical projects, though these usually translated to the right to hold additional fairs or, in truly generous moments, exemptions from tolls for transporting stone. Even these minor concessions were celebrated with processions, banners, and a marked increase in local complaints about outsiders crowding the streets. Religious life dominated the calendar, with the cathedral construction site acting as both a source of communal pride and a subject for whispered skepticism. Church bells sounded with a regularity that rivaled any timepiece, calling the faithful to worship, and on special days, summoning processions to bless the latest completed arch or stonework. Priests offered prayers for the safety of workers, though the frequency of accidents suggested that divine intervention was rationed with the same care as building materials. Pilgrims sometimes visited if a relic was promised or a particularly persuasive preacher passed through. Such visits brought a rush of trade, with merchants hawking bread, cheese, and questionable remedies from wooden stalls set up in the shadow of unfinished walls. The rhythms of trade continued in their familiar pattern, though the presence of the cathedral site altered the flow of goods. Stonecutters required supplies of food, ale, and occasionally new tools. Carpenters demanded vast quantities of timber for scaffolds and supports, timber that often arrived rough-hewn and damp from the nearest forest, filling the air with a sharp, green scent. Ironmongers' wares were in constant demand, and blacksmiths could count on steady work sharpening tools, dulled by the endless shaping of limestone. The market square was crowded with animals, baskets of turnips and onions, and bundles of wool, all sold beneath the distant noise of chisels and hammers. Agricultural cycles pressed on, indifferent to the ambitions of architects or clergy. Fields needed ploughing, and livestock required tending, regardless of whether a buttress required additional support. Families sent sons to the site when available, but only between planting and harvest seasons. The work was physically demanding, cutting stone, hauling lime, or mixing mortar by hand, and the compensation was rarely more than modest wages and the occasional promise of a hot meal. The town's women played their part as well, providing food, tending to minor injuries, and when necessary, joining in the labor when shortages dictated. Clothing was functional and bore the marks of work, earth stains, fraying edges, and the ever-present dust that seeped into every seam. The architecture of the Gothic cathedral itself introduced a new level of complexity to daily life. Flying buttresses, pointed arches, and ribbed vaults were innovations that not only required precise construction, but also a willingness to put faith in geometry rather than tradition. Masons debated techniques beneath the watchful gaze of the master builder, whose plans were often sketched in charcoal on wooden boards. Mistakes were inevitable, and on several occasions, spectacularly public. Repairs were made with a patience that would cause modern builders to reconsider their career choices. Townsfolk watched with a mixture of admiration and suspicion as walls rose higher, comforted by the knowledge that if disaster struck, it would at least be memorable. Political events rarely intruded on this cycle, unless war or plague forced a halt to construction. Armies marching nearby or outbreaks of illness might clear the site for weeks at a time, leaving unfinished arches and abandoned scaffolding to weather the elements. Losses among the workforce were met with resignation, and replacements arrived as soon as conditions allowed, drawn by the promise of employment that while demanding, was at least predictable. The cathedral project became a backdrop to the realities of feudal life, its delays and advances, part of the ongoing negotiation between survival and aspiration. Through it all, the senses of the townspeople absorbed the changing landscape. The air was a mix of stone dust, baking bread, and the occasional waft from the tannery. The sounds included the ring of hammers, the drone of prayer, and the steady complaints of livestock. Life persisted, unremarkable, and yet transformed by proximity to a project whose completion could never be assumed. For most, the cathedral was less a symbol of spiritual transcendence than a reminder of human endurance, and perhaps the inevitability of unfinished business. Within this constant landscape of work and worship, the social order remained both predictable and unyielding. The arrival of masons and carpenters was noted in the town registry, but they were seldom fully absorbed into the local community. These itinerant laborers lived in temporary lodgings, cramped wooden structures on the cathedral's edge, or in overcrowded inns, if space permitted, marked out by muddy paths and piles of discarded stone chips. Their accents, tools and techniques varied by region, making even basic instructions subject to negotiation. Townsfolk watched these skilled outsiders with an uneasy mix of respect and suspicion, mindful that new customs might slip in alongside new architectural methods. The master builder, sometimes imported from a distant city, exercised a peculiar authority. His role was both practical and ceremonial, translating the bishop's vision into stone, managing the labor force, and attending to the ceaseless stream of questions from nervous financiers. Communication was simplified by necessity, often reduced to gestures on chalked plans or curt instructions shouted above the noise. When problems arose, an arch that buckled, a wall that listed at the wrong angle, the master builder was expected to resolve the issue quickly, preferably before the bishop arrived for his weekly inspection. While dismissal was possible, the shortage of qualified replacements meant that most were simply reminded, in private and at length, of the importance of accuracy and thrift. The worksite itself reflected the priorities and limitations of medieval society. Safety was an optimistic concept, generally addressed by warning signs carved onto beams or by the recollection of last week's mishap. Children carried water for mortar, while elders fetched straw to mix into the scaffolding's mud. Some laborers wore rudimentary leather gloves or wrapped rags around their hands, but most relied on experience and caution to avoid injury. When accidents occurred, the response was practical and swift: a brief prayer, makeshift bandages, and a return to work as soon as possible. It was generally understood that a day was successful if everyone returned home with the same number of fingers as they began. Religious observance structured the week, shaping both hours of labor and moments of rest. Each morning commenced with prayer, sometimes led by a priest in residence, other times by the master builder himself, reading from a battered psalter. Midday breaks provided a measure of respite, a chance to eat bread, root vegetables, and perhaps a tough slice of salted meat. On feast days, construction halted, and the workforce joined the townspeople in the nave of the unfinished cathedral, listening as the bishop described the virtues of patience and sacrifice. These sermons were rarely short, reflecting the clergy's belief that spiritual endurance was, like architectural endurance, best measured in decades. Trade continued its necessary routes, though the construction of a cathedral could disrupt even well-established patterns. Merchants arriving from Flanders or the Rhineland found crowded gates and impatient officials tallying goods. Local craftsmen, tailors, cobblers, and potters complained that prices for basic materials had risen, blaming the insatiable appetite of the cathedral site for wood, iron, and wool. Markets were busier, though not always more profitable, and disputes over fees and measurements provided the council with a steady stream of grievances to ignore. The air in the square reminded everyone that commerce was rarely a tidy affair, carrying traces of spilled grain, damp wool, and on unfortunate days, fish left too long in the sun. Agriculture, though less dramatically altered by the cathedral, was not untouched. Fields closest to the town edge were sometimes requisitioned for storing stone or timber, leading to inevitable quarrels with farmers whose planting schedules were suddenly interrupted. Livestock wandered too near the worksite at their peril. It was said that sheep developed a marked dislike for the sound of chisels, though this did not prevent their owners from seeking compensation on those occasions, when an animal blundered into a trench. The rhythm of sowing and reaping remained, but with the added complication of construction dust drifting over the cabbages. As for the building itself, each new feature was observed with a mixture of wonder and exasperation. Townsfolk tracked the slow progress of the nave, the hesitant rise of the towers, and the uncertain fate of stained glass windows that seemed forever delayed by costs or mishaps. The ambition to reach greater heights was both a technical and social challenge. Masons debated the best way to lay each course of stone, while townspeople speculated on whether the finished building would ever be free of leaks. With every new stage, the cathedral grew more present in daily conversation, a source of pride, worry, and no small amount of unsolicited advice, from those whose experience of buildings began and ended with a thatched roof. The broader political climate offered its own reminders of uncertainty. News of distant wars, royal successions, or papal decrees arrived sporadically, occasionally prompting anxiety about new taxes or the shifting balance of power. Most of the time, however, such matters remained safely abstract, a topic for gossip rather than immediate action. The slow, noisy ascent of the cathedral was far more pressing than the intrigues of Paris or Rome. In the end, the daily routine continued. Stone was cut and lifted, bread was baked and eaten. The unfinished cathedral watched over it all, both a promise and a challenge, its cold stones absorbing every sound and every season as the years slipped steadily past. As seasons turned and construction ground onward, the cathedral's influence seeped further into the fabric of town life. The unfinished towers became both a landmark and a measuring stick for local ambition. The clergy paraded through the town at regular intervals, their vestments crisp and colored by the best dyes the region could afford. Parishioners observed these processions with respect, though there was a distinct difference between observing and volunteering. The expectation to contribute, whether in coin, material, or manual labor, was as routine as the ringing of the church bells. The cathedral was everyone's responsibility, which is to say that its requirements could be passed around indefinitely. The town's bureaucracy adapted, in its own haphazard way, to the new demands of the building project. Scribes were employed to track incoming donations, outgoing expenses, and the labyrinthine lists of who owed what. These records, painstakingly inscribed on parchment, were kept in a chest that was said to be both secure and surprisingly damp. Laws and edicts, issued by the bishop's chapter, trickled through the community, establishing guidelines on everything from the permitted height of market stalls to the frequency of prayers for the project's success. For every written rule, there existed a local interpretation, sometimes disputed at length in the tavern. The only constant was that the more people contributed, the more they were reminded of the need for further generosity. Children grew up, knowing their town would likely remain a work in progress. A person might be born and raise a family, while the choir was only halfway complete. Cathedral-related chores became a familiar part of growing up. Young boys fetched water to keep dust down, while girls carried baskets of lime or food for the workers. Older men and women gossiped about the latest delay, comparing the state of the nave to that of the grain harvest, often to the detriment of both. Elders, who remembered when the site was just a field, maintained a cautious optimism that the roof might yet be finished before their grandchildren outgrew their shoes. The rhythm of religious life moved in parallel with construction. Days were organized by the tolling of bells, which marked hours for prayer, work and rest. Major festivals, Easter, Pentecost, the feast days of local saints, were occasions for both celebration and subtle fundraising. Clergy extended their appeals during sermons, their voices rising above the drafty echo of unfinished walls. Relics were paraded through the streets for blessings, each appearance an opportunity to inspire awe and, ideally, loosen a few more purse strings. Parishioners handed over coins or goods, sometimes with genuine devotion, sometimes with the resigned air of someone paying for repairs to a leaking roof. Trade and agriculture absorbed the consequences of prolonged construction. Roads leading into town suffered under the weight of stone carts, their ruts deepening with every season. Market days were busier, but less orderly, as new vendors arrived to serve the labor force. Disagreements over prices or weights were as frequent as the sound of chisels. Some locals prospered from the influx of workers, while others resented the rising costs of basic goods. It was a familiar cycle, the promise of prosperity, followed by the reality of muddy lanes and higher prices for sheep's cheese. Political developments at the regional level occasionally left their mark. When royal courts changed hands, as with the accession of Edward I in England or Philip the Fair in France, new taxes or privileges might be announced. Such edicts were posted near the cathedral doors, where literate townsfolk gathered to interpret them for those unable to read. Most changes favored continuity over novelty, though a visiting royal official might be treated to a tour of the half-finished transept, complete with exaggerated tales of hardship and generosity. Royal interest, when it appeared, was short-lived, but could result in a token donation or the promise of a relic from a distant abbey. The material world of the cathedral grew ever more complex. The soundscape mixed prayer with labor, and the air thickened with the sense of sweat, cut stone, resin from scaffolding timbers, and on market days, an undertone of livestock. Tools grew worn, their handles darkened by years of use, and the faces of the workers reflected the slow progression of age and experience. Windows were fitted one by one, stained glass slowly illuminating the nave in colored patterns that looked best when the sun managed to break through the clouds. It was a gradual process, with each section celebrated before the next round of delays could set in. In this way, the town lived in the shadow of its cathedral, measured by the progress of arches and vaults, the rise and fall of fortunes, and the persistence of hope that something enduring might one day be finished. The cathedral's stones absorbed every argument, every prayer, and every passing season, while the people carried on with the reliable stubbornness that history so often rewards with anonymity. As the years compounded into decades, the gradual completion of each cathedral section became an event worth noting, if not exactly celebrating. The installation of a new vault, or the completion of a rose window, offered evidence that progress, however sluggish, was real. Townsfolk gathered for such occasions, peering up at scaffolding, while craftsmen and clergy exchanged careful nods. The bishop, when present, offered lengthy prayers that the finished portion would inspire devotion rather than further repairs. Children listened with the distracted patience only cultivated by those who have heard the same promises many times before. The slow pace of construction affected the social order in subtle but persistent ways. Skilled masons became minor celebrities, their expertise discussed in the market square, with the same mixture of awe and suspicion reserved for foreign dignitaries. A talented glassmaker could expect invitations to dinner from local officials eager to secure favorable rates for their own domestic repairs. Laborers, meanwhile, maintained their own hierarchy, new arrivals taking the lowest rungs, while those who had survived multiple building seasons enjoyed a quiet authority. Injuries were frequent and generally ignored, except in cases where the incident was particularly memorable or resulted in a delay visible from the bishop's residence. Religious rituals adapted to the building's shifting boundaries. Incomplete walls and open roofs necessitated creative solutions for processions, baptisms, and gatherings. Temporary wooden screens marked off sacred spaces, and tarpaulins shielded the altar from rain and pigeon droppings. The congregation's faith was tested not only by theological disputes, but by the stubborn unpredictability of medieval weather. On feast days, the choir's voices mingled with the whistle of wind through unfinished arches, creating a sound that was at best described as distinctive. Outside the cathedral, daily labor continued in seasonal cycles. Fields required planting, orchards needed pruning, and livestock demanded attention regardless of how many stones were laid that week. Some families managed small plots near the town, where vegetables grew in tidy rows and geese wandered with little awareness of ecclesiastical budgets. The local inn remained well attended, its benches filled with a blend of townsfolk, visiting merchants, and the ever-present construction workers. Stories of the cathedral's progress, or lack thereof, served as reliable conversation, often paired with complaints about taxes, the price of salt, and the latest architectural innovations. Trade patterns shifted to accommodate the project's needs. Caravans brought glass, pigments, fine cloth, and yet more iron. Their arrival greeted with a mix of anticipation and resignation. Local merchants benefited from the increased activity, yet also found themselves squeezed by fluctuating prices. Bargaining became more pointed, and accusations of short measure or adulterated goods more frequent. The rhythm of economic life was steady, but rarely comfortable, and anyone expecting a windfall from cathedral construction soon learned that profit and patience rarely traveled together. Politically, the town's fortunes rose and fell with wider dynastic changes. Edicts from the king's court in Paris or London arrived sporadically, often accompanied by a royal seal and a request for more money. Occasionally, a dignitary would visit, escorted by a retinue of officials, who remarked on the cathedral's promise, while quietly noting its unfinished state. Such occasions required hurried cleaning, borrowed tapestries, and a display of unity that lasted precisely as long as the visitor remained within earshot. When rulers such as Edward I or Philip the Fair imposed new taxes or reformed local governance, the primary response was a renewed sense of resignation among those who managed the building fund. The cathedral itself grew into the landscape, with a kind of inevitable permanence. Weather left its mark, stones darkened by rain, timbers bleached by sun, mortar crumbling slightly along exposed seams. Every addition carried a trace of those who made it, from the measured chisels of masons to the hurried brushwork of artists, coaxed into finishing before the next downpour. The stained glass windows, when finally fitted, cast shifting colors across stone floors, briefly transforming the nave into something approaching the visions described in sermons. Life at the cathedral's margins remained a study in practical adaptation. Meals eaten beside storage sheds, tools sharpened on stone steps, and prayers recited above the sound of hammers all became part of the routine. The town adapted to the cathedral's unfinished silhouette, much as it adapted to every other aspect of medieval existence, by carrying on, day after day, season after season, without waiting for perfection. The cathedral, for all its ambition, stood as a record of unfinished labor, persistent effort, and the modest victories that defined an age better known for endurance than for speed. By the time a cathedral began to resemble its intended form, an entire generation might have passed, their names quietly replaced by those of their children, in the records kept by the chapter house. The unfinished work became something inherited, a ritual as predictable as harvest or Holy Week. Older townspeople tracked progress by the slow extension of the nave, the addition of new chapels, or the moment when the scaffolding finally shifted from one end of the structure to the other. It was not unusual for a mason to point out the precise dates, remembered as years when the river froze early, or when the bishop's horse was lost in a flood, that marked each stage of completion. Daily life, meanwhile, pressed forward around these incremental milestones. The town itself grew in small increments, mirroring the slow certainty of the cathedral's rise. Homes clustered near the churchyard, their walls mottled with lichen and smoke from countless hearths. Market stalls lined the main square, the wooden planks, worn smooth by generations of feet. On any given morning, the air was sharp with the smell of damp stone, firewood, and baked bread. The thud of mallets and the rasp of chisels joined the clatter of carts and the calls of vendors, creating a soundscape that rarely abated, except for the quiet of Sunday services. Inside the growing cathedral, the clergy performed their duties amidst draughts and dust. Each new section required a blessing, a ritual that involved incense, holy water, and the recitation of prayers that managed to be both hopeful and apologetic. The clergy took care to remind all present that God's patience surely exceeded that of any mere mortal. The stained glass, now filtering colored light into the nave, drew admiration from the pious and the practical alike. One could see townsfolk pause to examine the figures of saints and biblical scenes, sometimes in search of familiar faces, subtly worked into the glass by local artisans. The influence of the cathedral extended into every aspect of civic life. The chapter house, where records and plans accumulated in uneven stacks, played host to a steady stream of scribes, officials, and anxious contributors. Taxation was a constant negotiation, with new levies justified by the need for another bell or repairs to the choir vault. The bishop's word remained law, although his authority could be quietly challenged in a tavern or over a fence. When a new ruler ascended to the throne, such as the arrival of Charles IV or the transition from the Plantagenets to the House of Lancaster, the town braced for fresh demands or a visiting retinue intent on inspecting the site. Such visits provided a carefully curated impression of order, with unfinished corners strategically hidden behind draped cloth or hastily arranged flowers. Trade patterns persisted, shaped now as much by reputation as by necessity. The town with an impressive cathedral drew pilgrims, traders, and the inevitable peddlers of dubious relics. Inns filled with visitors, their voices mingling with local gossip as they shared bread, ale, and the latest news from nearby cities. The influx of outsiders offered opportunities and inconveniences in equal measure. Prices rose in the market, new wares appeared on the stalls, and the competition for a dry place to sleep became more spirited as the festival calendar filled. Agriculture, as ever, provided stability. Fields outside the town walls produced wheat, rye, and vegetables, worked by families who measured their obligations to the church in both produce and days spent hauling supplies to the worksite. Livestock moved through muddy lanes on their way to pasture, providing the background chorus for every gathering. Changes in weather, or the arrival of pests, were discussed with the same seriousness as the progress on the cathedral itself. For all the grand ambition of soaring spires, there was no escaping the reality that food remained the true foundation of daily life. The architecture of the nearly finished building became a subject for debate. Some admired the slender columns and intricate tracery, while others questioned whether the roof would survive the next winter. Water seeped through unfinished joints, prompting hasty repairs and even hastier explanations. The bells, when finally installed, rang out with a bravado that belied the ongoing patchwork behind the scenes. Light played across the stone floors in shifting patterns, and the air was filled with the mingled scents of candle wax, damp stone, and the faintest memory of incense. So the town lived, year after year, in the shadow of its creation. The cathedral's stones and glass bore the imprint of countless hands, while the people adapted to its presence as they did to every other certainty of their world, by persisting through the seasons, enduring interruption, and quietly hoping that one day, completion might bring a peace as enduring as the stones themselves. Completion, when it finally approached, arrived with far less ceremony than had once been imagined. There were no great choruses of angels, only the measured toll of the cathedral bells, a few creaking ropes, and the collective sigh of those present. The final stones were set in place by hands that bore the memory of decades of labor. The master builder, long since retired or replaced, was commemorated by a modest plaque or a line in the chapter's dusty records. His name perhaps known only to a dwindling handful of townspeople. No single moment marked the transition from construction to finished monument, for the final scaffolding was often dismantled, only to make way for repairs or additions deemed suddenly essential. The town greeted completion, as it did any other significant change, with a combination of relief and skepticism. The bishop organized a formal dedication, attended by dignitaries, whose enthusiasm for the music and liturgy was rivaled only by their interest in the quality of the post-service wine. The townsfolk assembled at the cathedral doors, their best woolen garments brushed free of dust, waiting for the chance to step inside at last. Children regarded the towering vaults with curiosity, craning their necks to inspect saints, sculpted high above, while elders tested the new benches and commented, not always quietly, on the draftiness that seemed to have survived every stage of construction. Inside, the cathedral was startling in its scale and detail. Light filtered in through windows of colored glass, tracing shifting patterns across the flagstones. Incense drifted in the air, blending with the subtler but ever-present odors of stone and candle wax. The voices of the choir climbed upward, only faintly disturbed by the flutter of pigeons, still occasionally trapped beneath the roof beams. The altar gleamed, its gilding reflecting both piety and the accumulated efforts of endless fundraisers. The clergy took their places, moving with practiced solemnity through rituals that by now had been rehearsed for years in makeshift chapels and drafty side aisles. For the townspeople, the cathedral offered both pride and a new set of obligations. Its completion did not signal the end of expenses, quite the opposite. The roof, though new, insisted on leaking whenever the rain struck from a particular direction. The bells required regular maintenance, and the stained glass, while dazzling, had an unfortunate habit of cracking during cold snaps. Fundraising continued, now framed as preservation rather than completion. The chapter house grew more crowded with records, and the council meetings gained an extra agenda item: the discussion of repairs needed to keep the cathedral standing and presentable. Life outside the cathedral resumed its established patterns. Trade continued, though the influx of pilgrims brought both profit and complaint. Local farmers found additional markets for their produce during festivals, while innkeepers adjusted their rates to reflect the fluctuating demand for beds and stabling. The rhythm of agricultural work was rarely affected by the cathedral's ceremonies, save for the occasional conscription of labor to clear the square or prepare for an especially grand procession. The seasons cycled on, and the town's fortunes rose and fell with harvest and market. Political currents shifted as rulers came and went. The cathedral, now part of the town's identity, became a convenient backdrop for royal declarations and ecclesiastical disputes. Local leaders hosted visiting dignitaries beneath its vaults, providing guided tours that emphasized the structure's architectural virtues and overlooked the more persistent leaks. Edicts were announced from the steps, often accompanied by the sounds of restless livestock and a citizenry well versed in the art of polite indifference. On rare occasions, conflict or war in the surrounding region might send refugees to the cathedral's doors, where the clergy offered a mixture of sympathy, prayer, and reminders of the need for further donations. The cathedral, now complete, settled into its role as both monument and burden. Its stones absorbed the passing of generations, its windows filtering the sunlight and casting a shifting tapestry on the crowds below. For some, it was a symbol of heavenly ambition finally realized. For most, it was simply the place where marriages were blessed, disputes were settled, and life's milestones received their proper acknowledgement. Even finished, it demanded maintenance and patience, as persistent as ever. So the town moved forward, its routines shaped by a building that had taken generations to complete. The cathedral's silhouette marked the horizon, its spire rising above tiled roofs and muddy lanes, a quiet reminder that even the grandest achievements arrive through steady persistence and a certain tolerance for inconvenience. The cathedral, now an established presence at the center of town, became a fixed point around which everyday life rearranged itself. Its sheer size ensured that no one could ignore it. The morning sun crept across the nave's roof tiles and announced each day with a glint of colored glass, whether the townspeople felt prepared to greet it or not. The bells struck with measured insistence, calling parishioners to prayer or the market, and more occasionally, to some new cause for donation. The clergy continued on much as they had during construction, their days filled with ritual and repetition, though their sermons now echoed through stone vaults that seemed to swallow every word and return only the faintest approval. On market days, the square in the cathedral's shadow filled with stalls, barrels, and the clatter of commerce. Bakers offered loaves shaped with crude attempts at ecclesiastical design, crosses, doves, the occasional lopsided angel, while butchers displayed slabs of salted meat, more practical than decorative. The smell of livestock mingled with that of bread and damp wool, never fully banished by the efforts of the town's less optimistic street sweepers. Children darted between vendors, their games pausing only for the tolling of a bell or the arrival of a bishop's procession, resplendent investments more colorful than anything found in the dye pots of local weavers. Trade routes continued to pass through the town, some carrying pilgrims, hoping for a glimpse of the cathedral's relics or stained glass, others bringing cloth, wine, or iron tools. The influx of outsiders became a fact of life. Inns and alehouses enjoyed brisk business during festivals, though regulars never quite warmed to the company of strangers, with their odd accents and endless questions about the construction's finer points. The cathedral's reputation grew with each retelling, its actual flaws rarely mentioned in stories recounted by visitors upon their return home. The local merchants, always pragmatic, learned to adjust prices to the prevailing level of credulity. Within the cathedral itself, the routines of faith unfolded in a more settled fashion. The clergy led daily prayers, baptisms, and funerals, accompanied by choristers, whose voices now reverberated through the high stone ceilings. Incense drifted above the congregation, mingling with the more persistent scent of cold masonry, and the occasional draft from an ill-fitted window. Many of the townsfolk continued to believe in the power of ritual, though a few retained a quiet suspicion that all such grandeur might be, at least partially, for the benefit of the bishop's vanity. Maintenance quickly became an accepted part of cathedral life. Repairs to the roof, the slow replacement of cracked window panes, and the periodic reinforcement of flying buttresses ensured that a small army of craftsmen remained employed. The chapter house records grew ever more detailed, each entry a testament to the cathedral's ongoing ability to absorb both resources and patience. Fundraising persisted, now dressed in the language of preservation. The townspeople understood that, Much like the river that occasionally flooded the lower streets, the cathedral's needs would never truly recede. Political developments continued their slow march in the background. Kings and dukes issued new decrees from distant capitals, most notable among them the repeated demands for taxes to fund wars that had little visible impact on daily life, save for the occasional procession in support of a victorious monarch. The cathedral served as a backdrop to these civic gestures. Royal messengers sometimes read edicts on the cathedral steps, their words followed by a scattering of applause and a rapid return to more immediate concerns, such as mending a cloak or haggling over turnips. In rare moments of crisis, the cathedral's doors opened to shelter the townspeople from outside threats, a gesture more symbolic than practical but appreciated for its familiarity. Agriculture adapted in its usual stoic fashion to the new reality. Fields were sown and harvested, sometimes blessed by itinerant monks, seeking alms for the cathedral's ongoing expenses. The produce found its way to market, its price invariably linked to the latest round of repairs or celebrations. Livestock grazing on the outskirts provided the familiar music of rural life, indifferent to the ambitions that rose above them in stone and glass. The town, for all its changes, remained recognizably itself. Its people still measured time by the ringing of bells and the turning of seasons. The cathedral, once a vision and a burden, had become a landmark as unyielding as the hills beyond the fields, an achievement that, for all its grandeur, slipped quietly into the background of daily necessity. To those who lived in its shadow, this was perhaps the most remarkable accomplishment of all. The cathedral's steady presence shaped patterns of life that would have been unremarkable to any later generation. Yet it cast a long shadow of expectation across the town's institutions. Local guilds, once focused on the needs of cobblers or weavers, now counted masons and glaziers among their number, and their annual feasts echoed beneath stone vaults built by their own hands. The rhythm of apprenticeship and mastery became closely tied to the cathedral's maintenance, with new generations learning to read plans, mix mortars, or replace lead in the windows. For the fortunate few who showed exceptional skill, there was always a place on a scaffold, no matter how much the town had changed since the first stone was quarried. Religion remained inseparable from daily existence. Each month brought its procession, holy day, or minor festival, observed as much out of habit as out of conviction. The clergy, secure in their offices and vested in layers of wool and linen, continued to offer sermons on the virtues of patience, charity, and on occasion, the danger of pride. Bells signaled every transition: the start of the day, the arrival of a market wagon, the passing of a notable citizen. For the average townsman, these sounds blended together, providing a backdrop to a life spent in fields, shops, or under the eaves of the great cathedral. Trade adapted to the cathedral's draw as a center for both the faithful and the merely curious. Pilgrims from distant regions appeared at regular intervals, boots and sandals caked with the mud of unfamiliar roads. Vendors found new opportunities in selling tokens, snippets of cloth purportedly touched by a saint, or candles of varying quality. Not every visitor stayed long enough to contribute meaningfully to the town's coffers, but their presence brought a flush of languages and customs, as well as a brief sharpening of local tempers. Innkeepers, always quick to spot opportunity, set aside their best beds for wealthy travelers or clergy, while offering the usual fare, thick bread, thin ale, and stories of the cathedral's history, to the rest. Agriculture, for all its perennial importance, remained at the mercy of weather, pests, and the changing demands of both church and market. The fields around the town shifted between orderly rows of grain and patches, left fallow to recover from years of steady use. Harvests were blessed in the cathedral's nave, a ritual that combined practical pleading with ceremonial optimism. Bad years were met with stoic complaint, good years with cautious gratitude. The produce that filled the town's markets, onions, beans, pears, and the occasional haunch of pork, owed as much to the labor of families as to the changing priorities of cathedral repairs and celebrations. Architecture in the town adapted in quieter ways. Newer homes borrowed elements from the cathedral, a pointed arch here, a carved lintel there, though always executed with an eye to available funds rather than grandeur. The great building itself, now marbled with soot, and streaked by the rain of decades, remained both a standard and a warning. Skilled hands kept the flying buttresses secure and the gutters clear, but the occasional collapsed tile or cracked window was simply accepted as the cost of permanence. The chapter house, meanwhile, continued to accumulate records in careful Latin script, a growing testament to the ongoing dialogue between ambition and reality. Political changes filtered in as distant news, rarely urgent, but always present. When Charles of Valois entered a quarrel with his rivals, or when news reached the town of a new archbishop in the capital, the cathedral served as the stage for public proclamations. At such times, the steps of the West Front became crowded with townsmen, craning to hear the verdict, while officials reminded all assembled of their duties as subjects and Christians. The clergy, ever adept at navigating shifts in power, offered prayers for stability and unity, quietly confident that the cathedral would outlast any current dispute. Sensory details lingered, unchanged by the passage of years. The air inside the cathedral was cool in summer, clammy in winter, and always tinged with the scent of wax and stone. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass, painted the floor in shifting blocks of color. Outside, the voices of merchants, the bark of dogs, and the ring of hammers provided an ongoing accompaniment to every hour. Life, shaped by the cathedral's presence, went on, orderly, repetitive, and marked by small acts of perseverance, more lasting than any sermon or royal decree. Season after season, the cathedral's presence matured from spectacle to certainty. Its towers and portals, once the focus of awe and curiosity, became landmarks so familiar that townspeople used them to measure distances, gossip about weather, and occasionally, to settle mild arguments about the best place to watch market day unfold. For the most part, the townspeople moved through its shadow with an ease born of habit, nodding to passing clergy or sidestepping the latest repair scaffolding, as if it were simply another part of the pavement. Religious ritual continued to mark the town's calendar, bringing a sense of order to the passage of time. Feast days and processions provided regular punctuation. On St. Michael's Day, or the festival of Corpus Christi, the streets filled with banners, borrowed relics, and the faint murmur of prayers recited more from repetition than from enthusiasm. The bishop, when present, was greeted with careful respect and the faintest air of calculation as parishioners weighed the likelihood of a new round of donations being requested. The clergy, increasingly absorbed by the routines of administration, found that sermons on humility could be delivered with particular conviction from the comfort of canopied choir stalls. Life around the cathedral was not without its small disturbances. The arrival of itinerant preachers or foreign pilgrims broke the monotony, introducing unfamiliar accents and the odd theological dispute for the local tavern to digest. The town hosted occasional ecclesiastical councils or visiting choirs, events that required careful coordination and the suspension of ordinary grievances. For a few days, the inns overflowed, the bakers' ovens worked overtime, and the cathedral's bells rang more often than anyone thought strictly necessary. Once the visitors departed, normality returned with gratifying speed, carrying with it the familiar complaints about prices, noise, and the scandalous behavior of someone else's apprentice. Trade, too, found its rhythm. The market beneath the cathedral's gaze remained a lively affair, stocked with produce from outlying farms, salted fish, hauled from the nearest river, and bolts of homespun wool dyed in colors that faded reliably by midsummer. The town's merchants learned to adapt to changing demand, trading in wine one year and grain the next, always attentive to the slow trickle of news from larger cities. The cathedral's own requirements, from beeswax for candles to fine linen for altar cloths, provided a steady income for a select few. Those who hoped for more dramatic profits from the influx of pilgrims found their expectations gently corrected by the realities of medieval accounting. Agricultural life, though little changed in its essentials, remained tied to the fortunes of the cathedral and the weather. The fields closest to town provided wheat, oats and hay, tended by families who counted the bells as a measure of both time and distance. Livestock grazed in pastures that, over generations, had been shaped as much by human hands as by the herds themselves. Wet years brought complaints about mud on the cathedral's floor, while dry seasons led to disputes over who was responsible for watering the greenery in the churchyard. The priests blessed both the crops and the livestock in careful measured tones, noting that divine favor did not always extend to sparrows in the rafters or cabbages left untended. The cathedral's fabric aged in step with the town. The stone darkened, the mortar shrank, and the stained glass acquired a subtle film of dust that no amount of labor could quite banish. Maintenance became a regular occupation in itself, employing laborers to mend leaking roofs, and masons to replace the more adventurous gargoyles that attempted escape each winter. The chapter house was a hive of quiet calculation, where senior canons debated budgets, repairs, and the merits of hiring new craftsmen. Records were written and rewritten, their parchment pages filled with notations about rain, expenses, and the number of candles required for Easter Vigil. Political shifts at the kingdom's edge filtered through this world, sometimes with little warning. News of new taxes or royal marriages arrived in bursts, discussed at length and acted upon only when absolutely necessary. The cathedral provided a convenient platform for official announcements, its steps crowded by those eager to hear not so much the proclamation as the inevitable complaints that followed. Most townsfolk regarded such affairs with the same mild skepticism they reserved for sudden miracles or unexpected visits from archdeacons. So the years unfolded, each one much like the last. The cathedral, firmly rooted at the center of the town's affairs, became less a symbol of unreachable grandeur than a companion to daily life, a structure that absorbed ambition, disappointment, and the slow but relentless passage of time. Everyday existence continued beneath its shadow, steady, persistent, and only rarely surprised by the world beyond its walls.